point, the war was still going on, and so people in the city had not learned to forgive children at this point. They thought of us as people who were still capable of tremendous violence. Some people pulled kids out of schools that we were put in to go. If we went to classrooms when we saw some of the kids that came out of war, people sat away from us. Sometimes you'd be speaking to somebody and you put your hand in your pocket, they will run away because they thought you were reaching for a bayonet or something of that sort. So that was very difficult to make friends with anyone. Everyone distrusted that you had actually recovered from this violence. I was living with my uncle, who was the only family member they could find to reunite me with in the capital city. And while I was living there, an opportunity came to send 2 young people to the United Nations in New York to speak based on a research that a woman called Graça Machel had done about the impact of armed conflict on children. And she had gone to Sierra Leone and spoken to some of us. So I was brought to New York with another friend who actually now lives in Montreal here in Canada. This was my first time and his first time living in Sierra Leone. We had just come out of this war, and then here we are. We had passports that were given to us, and we were on the plane heading to New York. We had no idea where we were going, and so we were wearing T-shirts. So when we arrived in New York, it was winter of 1996. I will never forget how cold I felt. I didn't think I would ever want to come back to North America. I felt it was impossible for human beings to function in that kind of weather. But also, I'll tell you just a few things about my experience coming to the United States. When we got on the plane in Lunge, the airport in Freetown, it was the first time also in my life that I had salad. I had never had salad in my life before. And I remember really thinking to myself, I am certainly not interested in having grass, you know, because this is how I felt. I was a village boy. I didn't know what this was. And I also remember when we landed at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, where you have the moving walkway, you know, you stand on it and it moves. And I remember thinking, when I went back to Sierra Leone after the conference, I was discussing this with my family. My uncle said, you know, I told my uncle, you just stand on the ground and it takes you to the other part. You don't have to do anything at all. And my uncle felt that this magic would have been so helpful to have in Sierra Leone during the war, because people would just stand and they would go to the other side of the country. They won't have to run from the war. Of course, at this point, we hadn't figured out what this mechanism was. And also, you know, when I came to live in New York at that time, it was the first time I had a room to myself. I was given a whole hotel room in Midtown Manhattan. I didn't know what to do with myself. I was absolutely fascinated with the fact that you could open this tap water, this red thing, and hot water would just come out. And you know, I was absolutely fascinated. Things that you may take for granted. For me, this was amazing, because where I came from, if you needed to bathe with hot water, you went to fetch firewood, you went to fetch the water, and you boiled the water. And then you cool it down with cold water to the temperature you wanted. So I couldn't understand that you just open. Again, my uncle was very fascinated with these things when I told him. He felt there was a guy on the other side boiling water. And so when you were ready, you turned it, he just poured it down, and you sort of, you know, you were able to get it. But anyway, during this conference is also when I met the woman who later became my mother, my adopted mother in the United States. Her name is Laura Sims. She's a professional storyteller. She was one of the facilitators for this conference. We met, we became friends, and I went back to Sierra Leone after the conference ended, and I stayed in touch with her. But then the war came to the capital city where I was living in '97, and I couldn't live there because most of my friends were coming from the countryside into the capital city, and if I had stayed, I would have been re-recruited a second time around. Some of my friends who couldn't leave because they didn't have access to a travel document were recruited a second time around. So I left and went through Guinea, which is the next door country, went to Ivory Coast, went as far as Cape Town, South Africa, and eventually was able to get a visa all the way back in Ivory Coast to come to the United States. Now, it was during this journey that I began to think about either speaking vigorously about this or writing about it. Because when I went to the American Embassy to get a visa, one of the questions that I was asked was to provide 2 documents. One was a bank account, a statement that I have money in the bank, a bank statement. And second was to provide proof that I had ownership of property in Sierra Leone. And I looked at the guy and I said to him, you know, there's a civil war going on in Sierra Leone. He said, so do you have those documents? And I was sitting there thinking to myself, even if there wasn't a war going on in Sierra Leone, a child my age in Sierra Leone would not have a bank account. Even if you have a bank account, let's say you had one, during the war you're not hearing a gunshot and you think to yourself, you know, I must take my bank account. Yeah, my bank papers, you know, I will need them, you know. And also when I arrived to live in the United States, my mom started taking me to apply for certain schools, high schools, because I didn't have a report card. They always ask me, so where's your report card? And I said, well, I don't have a report card. I said, well, everyone has a report card. And I said, well, yeah. You know, and I kept thinking to myself also, oh, you know, I really heard a gunshot, and I thought to myself, you know, I should take my report card. I may end up in New York, and I may need this, you know. So these things were funny to me, but also telling in the sense that I realized people do not have an understanding of what war does to human beings, how it devastates communities, how you basically, if you go down to the store to get a drink or to buy something and you hear a gunshot, the next chapter of your life begins where you are. Whatever you're wearing, whatever you're carrying, that's what you would have for however many months you. The only thing that you're lucky to get out of it in war is your life, if you're extremely lucky. And I tried to explain that to people. People couldn't understand it. Another thing that led me to the writing of the book was that when Sierra Leone began appearing in the news in New York, in the United States, and everywhere, there was so much bent on the media sensationalizing the violence with no context, to the point that people whose first introduction to Sierra Leone came through this medium, their perception of Sierra Leone became Sierra Leone equals civil war, amputation, madness, and nothing more. So when I would say to people I'm from Sierra Leone, they thought, oh, that country with the amputation. And I thought there was a Sierra Leone before the war. The context was needed for people to understand that there's nowhere in the world where people just wake up one morning and say, you know, I want to be a child soldier, or I just want to fight. There are things that lead to it, and I wanted people to understand that context. And for people to know that there was a Sierra Leone before the war, during the war, and there's a Sierra Leone that's possible after the war. That Sierra Leone during the war is not the entirety of its history. That's not how you understand the history of that nation at all. And also that this country was not hopeless even during the war. If it were hopeless, I would not be standing in front of you. Even during the war, people tried to keep families together. People found time to laugh. Sierra Leoneans are the most hopeful and resilient people you could find on the face of the earth. You know, and I wanted people to understand these kinds of things, for people to know that as a kid, I was dancing to MC Hammer, as some of the kids were in North America. Because when people understand these things, then it becomes personal. Then you can see the humanity that even though in Sierra Leone, the conditions in which we may have lived our lives were different, our humanity is the same as anyone else anywhere. We have the same human tendencies, needs, and wants and desires. I wanted people to understand that. Lastly, what did upset me tremendously was that people began speaking about child soldiers as a lost generation. They had this term they call it the lost generation, which was that once your life had gone through this, you would never be able to recover. There was nothing you could do. And here I was living in the United States, finishing high school, going to college, and the same people saying lost generation. I'm thinking to myself, the only time I felt lost was when I was trying to navigate what kind of food I needed to eat in the United States, because I didn't know the names of the food. I didn't particularly like the cuisine, and various other things, you know. So I wanted to talk about the fact that it is possible with the right care and support for people to come out of this experience and become active members of society. It is not easy. It is a very difficult task, but it is possible. And I wanted people to understand that. And I decided to put a human face to this experience by starting to speak about it and then later on writing about it. So this is really what led to the writing of this book. And since it came out, it had done things that I didn't anticipate for it to do. When I was actually writing it, when I finished writing it, I didn't want to publish the book because it was very personal and it was very painful to write. So I didn't want to publish it at all. I was starting to go to law school, and my professor said, you know, show it to some people and see what happens, and I did. And also during that period, they tried to, some people that I showed to before I found my original publisher, Farrar Straus and Jury in New York, they said to me when I gave it to them, too much context. Why don't you just tell us about the war? We want to know about the war. That's what people are interested in. And I said to them, if I want to tell you about the war, if I want to tell you about just the madness with no context, I would not do it. I would not write a book. I can give a talk. I've seen a lot of horrible things and being part of it. I can do a very good job in traumatizing people tremendously. But what would they gain out of it if their perception of African countries just going to war like that remains the